Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly highly provocative historical argument. We're looking directly at Chapter 21 of Howard Zinn's celebrated book, A People's History of the United States. In this chapter, Zinn presents a striking thesis that the American two-party system, particularly from 1977 to 1992, mostly just presented voters with an illusion of choice. Instead of fundamental differences, Zinn argues that the Democrats and Republicans basically operated under a shared underlying agreement that maintained the status quo. So get ready, because we're going to look closely at the data and the history Zinn uses to build this compelling case. Okay, let's dive right into this. Zinn actually frames his entire chapter by citing another prominent historian, Richard Hofstadter, who noted that the major parties have always been bounded by the horizons of property and enterprise. Zinn uses this to neutrally establish the historical limits of American politics. The argument here isn't about individual politicians being inherently good or bad. It's really about a structural boundary. Zinn suggests that neither party was willing or even able to look past a system that fundamentally encouraged enormous corporate fortunes right alongside deep poverty and military expansion. Which brings us to the core concept of this explainer, the bipartisan consensus. So what exactly is that? Well, according to Zinn, this consensus is basically an unwritten agreement that both major U.S. political parties consistently prioritize two things above all else: corporate wealth and military expansion. And Zinn argues that they do this even when it directly conflicts with social welfare or the actual will of the public. The text makes the case that from Jimmy Carter through Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, a solid 15-year stretch, this consensus held completely fast, regardless of whether a Democrat or a Republican was sitting in the Oval Office. Here is our roadmap for breaking this down. We'll start with the bipartisan consensus itself, then Carter's centrist shift, third, Reagan and Bush economics, fourth, the permanent military machine, and fifth, ignoring the public will. Section 1, the Democratic shift, focusing on Jimmy Carter's administration. You gotta remember the historical context here. Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 to recapture a really disillusioned citizenry. The American public was just reeling from the trauma of the Vietnam War, the whole Watergate scandal, and deep economic insecurity. Coming out of all that, Carter used some incredibly powerful populist rhetoric to win people back. He spoke passionately about human rights, he appointed civil rights veterans like Andrew Young to the UN, and famously told a meeting of lawyers that the law too often just protected the rich. Yet, the establishment reality was quite different. His most crucial cabinet appointments were drawn from traditional Cold War intellectuals and corporate leaders, many connected to the elite Trilateral Commission. Zinn argues that this populist messaging basically masked a strict continuation of establishment policies. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what Zinn means by policy continuity. Despite all that rhetoric about change, Carter approved an $18 billion tax reduction that heavily favored corporations. He pushed for the rederegulation of natural gas, which was a massive boon for huge energy companies. On top of that, Carter actually proposed a $10 billion increase to the military budget, and his administration continued to financially and militarily support brutal dictatorships in places like Iran and Nicaragua right up until they were overthrown. For Zinn, Carter maintained the historic boundaries of the American system perfectly. Section 2, Reagan and Bush economics, or what Zinn calls the corporate triumph. Following Carter's defeat, Ronald Reagan, and later George H.W. Bush, brought a much more overtly pro-business ideology to Washington. But Zinn frames this Republican ascendancy of the 1980s not as a reversal of Carter's policies, but actually as an aggressive acceleration of that very same bipartisan consensus. The source material details how the Reagan and Bush administrations focused almost exclusively on economic growth for corporate profit. This era saw massive tax cuts aimed right at the wealthiest Americans. Regulatory bodies like OSHA, which protects worker safety, and environmental protection agencies were actively gutted in favor of voluntary compliance by businesses. And perhaps most glaringly, the deregulation of the savings and loan industry, which actually began under Carter and continued under Reagan, resulted in a catastrophic financial collapse. It left the public to foot a staggering $200 billion bailout bill, while both parties essentially kept voters in the dark during the 1988 election because both were complicit. Now check out this tiny number, 5.8%. According to Internal Revenue Service figures cited by Zinn, this was the average tax rate actually paid by the leading oil companies back in 1974. Zinn uses this to highlight the profound maldistribution of wealth in America, noting that the top 1% of the nation owned 33% of the wealth, and the largest corporations paid exceptionally low actual tax rates, regardless of what the official tax brackets nominally stated. But Zinn makes a real point to emphasize that this wasn't just a Republican initiative. He quotes the author William Grider, who points out that the turning point on tax politics actually occurred in 1978, long before Reagan arrived in Washington, while the Democratic Party was fully in power. Zinn uses this data to impartially report that the upward shift in tax burdens, where payroll taxes for working people went up while corporate taxes went down, was actively supported by Democratic majorities every single step of the way.
All right, Section 3, the permanent military machine.
Zinn argues that the preservation of a massive military establishment and the willingness to actually use it was a twin objective shared equally by both parties throughout this era. Just look at this timeline derived from the text. It reveals a continuous, bipartisan assertion of American military authority abroad. In 1981, the Reagan administration poured massive funding into El Salvador's military despite horrific human rights abuses. In 1986, the secret funding of the Contras in Nicaragua was exposed. Under George H.W. Bush, 1989 brought the invasion of Panama to oust Manuel Noriega, who, by the way, was a dictator the U.S. had previously supported. And then in 1991, the massive Gulf War against Iraq. Through it all, Zinn notes that leading Democrats in Congress consistently voted to support these military interventions, mostly to prove they were just as tough on foreign policy as the Republicans. The Iran-Contra affair is honestly a perfect case study for Zinn. The Reagan administration secretly funded the Nicaraguan Contras, directly overriding a congressional ban. They relied on the classic government device of plausible denial to shield the president and vice president. But how did the opposition respond? Well, instead of a powerful critique of secret government actions, leading Democrats focused on restoring the president's credibility. For Zinn, the resulting scandal exposed a system where both parties basically lacked the resolve to challenge the underlying military apparatus or push for genuine democratic transparency. Which leads us to this massive, massive figure, $280 billion. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the complete collapse of the Soviet Union, literally the very enemy that had justified the Cold War military buildup for decades, the U.S. military budget was barely reduced. It's truly amazing the so-called peace dividend just never materialized. Instead, the budget was maintained at a staggering $280 billion, supported overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans. Section 4. Ignoring the public will. This is perhaps the most provocative part of Zinn's analysis. He argues that this bipartisan consensus wasn't just maintaining the status quo, it was doing so in direct opposition to the actual desires of the American people. The media absolutely loved to call Reagan's 1980 win an overwhelming victory, but let's look at the actual math Zinn provides. Only 54% of the voting age population even cast a ballot. So, of the total eligible voters, Reagan was actually chosen by just 27%. Nearly half the country, 46%, simply stayed home. Zinn uses this to show that an electorate forced to choose between candidates who both represented corporate wealth simply despaired, and they opted out. And here's where it gets really surprising. You'd think the public in the supposedly conservative 1980s wanted a massive military and low taxes, right? Actually, majorities supported a mutual nuclear weapons freeze with the Soviets. They wanted genuinely progressive taxation where the rich paid a fairer share. Polls showed 59% of voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending. And believe it or not, 61% favored a universal Canadian-style healthcare system. But because of the two-party consensus, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans adopted these highly popular positions into their actionable platforms. Ultimately, Zinn suggests we need a completely new lens to view American history. As the text notes, it is far more accurate and illuminating to view the political struggle not strictly as Democrat versus Republican. Instead, Zinn asks us to see it as a three-cornered fight. On one side, you have the two major parties, bound together by a shared consensus to protect corporate enterprise and military might. And on the other side, you have the American public, whose desires for peace, equity, and social welfare are repeatedly left unrepresented. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful question to reflect on. Howard Zinn's analysis covers the years from Carter to Bush, but the structural boundaries he identifies are profound. Does a bipartisan consensus still bound American politics today? When you look past the intense, modern partisan rhetoric we see on the news every day, are the underlying structural realities, the protection of wealth and the maintenance of a global military, still firmly in place? It's an absolutely critical lens through which to view our world, and one that encourages us to look much deeper than the surface of the ballot box. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.